It's time for one last Seattle Kraken mock expansion draft. And I don't want to hear any, there's no way the Tampa Bay Lightning are going to go 4-4 protection, or there's no way the Blues are going to leave Tarasenko exposed, because this time, protection lists are final. Now, I will be doing a full mock draft here, but this is still going to be mostly an update on my original mock expansion draft, so if you want a little bit more of why I made each of these picks, if I don't explain one as much as you would like, then I would go check out that video if you haven't watched it already. And finally, as far as the order of the picks, last time I went forwards, defense, then goalies, but for the sake of simplicity this time, I'm just going to go alphabetical. So let's get started with the Anaheim Ducks. For the most part, this protection list ended up being pretty much what I expected it to be, with the exceptions of Danton Heinen spot on the forward end being taken by Nicolas Deslauriers, and on the defensive end, Haydn Fleury ended up getting exposed in place of Josh Manson, who was protected. And when it comes to taking a player from this team, at first I wanted to take Heinen, and even Volkov, who has a contract on the forward end, was another tempting option, but I ended up going with Haydn Fleury because we need to sign 9 defensemen, and I filled up the forward slots elsewhere. So yeah, I know Haydn Fleury might not be the best option of any of the players on this team, but he is the best defenseman with a contract for next year, at least to me anyway, which is why I ended up going with him. Now, if we can find a contract elsewhere, then Josh Mahura is another good defensive option, and if we can find another defenseman somewhere else, then either one of those guys on the forward end could also be a pretty good choice for the Kraken. In Arizona, we had to make another business-type decision in order to meet the expansion draft requirements, more so than necessarily taking the best available player. And that's all because the guy who it looked like was going to be a lock for a Kraken selection from the Coyotes up until the last couple of days in Adin Hill found himself getting traded to the San Jose Sharks, so now it's back to the drawing board in Arizona, and honestly, there just aren't a whole lot of particularly tempting options, so if there's a place that we're going to make, let's just say, some concessions in order to meet exposure requirements, this is one of the places we have to do it. So ultimately, I ended up taking the guy that Hill was traded for in Joseph Kornar. And that's pretty much entirely because he has a contract, and the Kraken do have to take 20 guys with contracts. So as much as I would have loved to take either Michael Bunting or maybe even Dryden Hunt, neither of them has a contract for next season, and I think that we can spend those non-contracted picks, which we only have 10 of, a little bit better than on one of those two. So feel free to disagree with me in the comments, I could still definitely be convinced otherwise, and it's not like Kornar's a waste of a pick, he's still a young goaltender who might not be ready for the NHL just yet, but as you'll see, we have a pretty good starting tandem, so he could start off in the AHL and develop there, or maybe get traded. With the Boston Bruins, this is another protection list where not a lot changed from what I had in my original mock draft and what I expected. The only change was the fact that Trent Frederic ended up getting the spot that I had going to Nick Ritchie. And while Nick Ritchie certainly does offer a pretty tempting option on the forward end that I wouldn't be terribly disappointed if the Kraken ended up going with, I still feel pretty confident about the fact that the Kraken will still end up going with Jeremy Lauzon, as I think he's still probably the best option here. With the Sabres, again, there was no real surprises here. The only difference between this protection list and the one that I had was the fact that Jeff Skinner did officially waive his no movement clause, which I think we all kind of expected to happen, but I didn't have that on that list, so now Rasmus Asplund is protected instead of him, which does pretty much remove the last tempting option on the forward end. So I think it's still pretty safe to say that Colin Miller is the likely selection here. Obviously, William Borgen is still another potential option, but I think Miller gets the nod because he has a contract, and again, I think those non-contracted picks can be better used elsewhere. Plus, this does mean that Colin Miller gets to have the fun distinction of being selected in both of the last 2 expansion drafts, and that is actually pretty cool experience that he'll be able to offer to this team, having been a part of that Vegas team that went to the Stanley Cup final in their first year. With the Calgary Flames, this is actually a pretty similar situation to what we just talked about with Buffalo. The only difference is being that we already knew Lucic was going to waive his no movement clause, so this protection list looks exactly the same as it did in my last mock expansion draft. And then the big difference being that instead of Oliver Shillington, who I originally had selected, I'm now taking Mark Giordano. And again, to me, this has everything to do with the fact that Giordano has a contract and Shillington doesn't. Now, obviously, Giordano would be a very solid pick and has a lot that he could offer Seattle, but also has a pretty big contract, which is why I originally picked Shillington. Plus, there's also the fact that we know that the Flames aren't overly excited about the idea of losing Giordano for free in expansion drafts, so there is the chance that a side deal could happen here for the Kraken to pick anybody but him. But for now, I have some experience coming to the blue line for the Kraken, with Mark Giordano being the pick. Carolina's protection list did have, well, a couple of small surprises anyway. I did have the 7th protection slot on the forward end going to Nino Niederreiter, but instead they decided to protect Jesper Fast, who I was looking at as a potential option. But ultimately, to me, this selection for the Kraken came down to which one of Brady Skjei or Jake Bean ended up getting protected on the defensive end. Originally, I thought they would go with Jake Bean, but instead they've decided to protect Skjei, so now I think the pick for the Kraken would be Jake Bean. Of course, there is also Morgan Geekie on the forward end if they were able to get their defense elsewhere, but I don't think there's really a need to, as Jake Bean would be a pretty good selection. So at least up until this point, there haven't really been any big surprises as far as protection lists are concerned. That kind of changes a little bit when we get to the Chicago Blackhawks, where I definitely was not expecting to see Adam Gaudette exposed. Chicago is definitely one of the teams that had their fair share of involvement in the craziness that was the couple of days leading up to the protection lists being due, which definitely includes the trade of Duncan Keith to the Edmonton Oilers. Now, I originally thought that trading Keith was their way of making room to protect Nikita Zadorov, who I knew that they liked, but was still my original pick by the Kraken from this team. Instead, though, they have decided to go ahead and protect Caleb Jones, who was part of that Keith trade. So Zadorov is still available, and to me, he's still the pick here. Now, there is definitely some temptation to go for Adam Gaudette on the forward end, but I still think that Zadorov is probably the type of guy that Ron Francis is looking for on his blue line, so I'd have a hard time seeing him pass him up unless there's some kind of side deal here. And that brings us to the Colorado Avalanche, and this one makes me a little bit sad. I mean, go figure, it's my two favorite teams over the last few years in the Avalanche and Wild that did the most to hurt my feelings during the last couple of days, and we'll get to the Wild in just a second, but I was looking forward to that first defensive pairing involving Ryan Graves, but that's not going to happen now as he is protected in New Jersey. And on top of that, my backup option in Nichushkin ended up getting protected on the forward end, instead of Gabriel Landeskog, which we'll get to in just a second. But fortunately, there is another surprise on the protection list on the forward end, where Logan O'Connor ended up protected instead of Jonas Donskoy. So unless the Kraken make a pick completely out of left field here and go for like Jacob McDonald on the defensive end, I think Donskoy is the pick here. Now, I know what you could be thinking, why not Landeskog if he's exposed? Well, he is set to be a UFA, and while they could select a UFA to make sure that they're the first ones that have a chance to sign him, again, they have to use those spots pretty carefully, and Landeskog and the Avalanche, from everything we've heard, are not particularly close on getting a contract done, so this isn't the type of situation where they have to jump on it while they have the chance, and instead could make a run at Landeskog in free agency after the expansion draft. But getting back to protection lists that were a little bit more pretty much exactly what we expected, with the Columbus Blue Jackets, there was really only one surprise here, but that being said, it was one of the bigger ones that snuck out as a rumor originally while all the trades and stuff were happening, and then was made official this morning when the protection lists were released. And that was the fact that instead of protecting Max Domi on the forward end, the Blue Jackets have decided to protect Eric Robinson, which was the guy that I was originally taking from this team, but honestly, if they're going to offer up Max Domi, assuming he's healthy, which the Kraken will have access to figuring out, I think it's hard to pass up a guy like this, especially at the center position, which is one of the lighter areas that the Kraken are going to have a harder time filling. So really, the only reasons I can think of that Max Domi wouldn't be the pick by the Kraken here would again be if there was some sort of health concern that they think he might not be able to start next season, or if they just really wanted to save some money and pick up a guy off the defensive end, in which case Dean Kukin could definitely help with that, his $1.65 million contract is definitely a lot cheaper than Domi's $5.3 million. Both of which, though, end at the end of 2022, so it's not like they're locked in long-term either way. And that brings us to the Dallas Stars, which, ugh. I mean, if there's one team that did a particularly good job of making sure that there wasn't a whole lot for the Kraken to choose from, it would be the Stars. They managed to get Ben Bishop to waive his no-movement clause so that they could protect Khudobin, and then on the forward end, they were able to protect Pavelski, which we kind of saw coming, but also traded away Dickinson, so now there really just almost isn't a single tempting option. Really, the closest thing there is to one would be the UFA contract of Jamie Oleksiak. That having been said, again, he's a UFA, so they'd have to use one of their 10 non-contracted picks on him, and there's no guarantee that he doesn't have something set up with Dallas under the table, so he could just end up walking in free agency and going right back to the Stars. Ultimately, I don't really know what the Kraken do here. Maybe they take Oleksiak and let him walk. Maybe just in order to fill exposure requirements, they take a cheap contract like Tanner Kyrou on the forward end. I don't know. There's not going to be a big headline pick made here, that much I can guarantee. With the Red Wings, this protection list does have a few different names on it from what my original one did, but I'm not sure there's enough significant changes to convince me to not go with Evgeny Svechnikov still, so that's probably who I am going to end up picking, though because of the picking up of Leddy and then deciding to protect Lindholm, that does mean that Troy Stecher is available, and that could also be a decent option for the Kraken. Especially if, to go back to Arizona or Anaheim at the beginning, if they want to just take Stecher, who has a contract, so that they have one more RFA potential option, then they could go with Stecher here rather than Svechnikov, and that gets them a contracted defenseman, which could open up options elsewhere, but for now, I'm going to stick with Svechnikov. The Oilers are another one of the teams that early on in the weekend seemed like they were just trying to bum out us Kraken fans when they traded away Caleb Jones, who we were kind of excited about being one of the locked-in picks for Seattle. But then they made up for it by protecting Josh Archibald and exposing Dominic Cahoon, so that's who I'm going to end up picking. That having been said, I could also easily be talked into the Kraken taking Tyler Benson instead, and if they need someone with a contract, then Kyle Turris is also available. Of course, if you haven't been able to keep up with all of the news that's been coming out over the last few days, which I certainly can't blame you for, then the other name on this exposure list that could be tempting to look at would be Oscar Klefbom, but we also now know that it sounds like his injury probably is going to keep him out the entirety of this next season, and at this point could be career-threatening, so there's just no way that the Kraken will go for him. For the Florida Panthers, I guess I'll show you their protection list, because what the heck, why not? Maybe you haven't seen it and you're curious, but it really doesn't sound like it's going to end up mattering, because it's pretty much all but official at this point that the Kraken are going to end up picking and signing Chris Driedger. Again, yes, Driedger is a UFA, but the Kraken can still pick him, and now do have a few-day window of exclusive access to negotiate and sign him, so then they don't have to worry about potentially competing with other teams in free agency, so it's definitely the best option to go for one of the guys that look to be one of the best goalie free agents coming into this next free agency period. Now the Kraken have their guy. Or at least one of them anyway. I still think there's a pretty decent chance that this is more of a goalie tandem than a starter backup type of scenario, but Driedger probably still starts out as the 1A in that scenario. The Kings, as we've known for a little while now, were one of the teams involved in that first expansion draft related trade with the Nashville Predators, in which they picked up Victor Arvidsson, so we already have known for a little bit that this protection list would look at least somewhat different from my original one, but then they also decided to protect Dustin Brown rather than Andreas Athanasiou, so it definitely looks quite a bit, or I guess there's one more name that looks different from what we were expecting coming into this protection list being released. With Athanasiou exposed, honestly, I think he's probably the pick here, but there are a number of relatively similar type of options from the Kings, so this isn't one that I feel super confident about, but I think Athanasiou is a pretty good option and can play center, which is definitely a bonus. Of course, Athanasiou is set to be an RFA, so he would take up one of those 10 non-contracted picks, but probably the next best option is also an RFA, and I could also definitely be easily convinced to take, that being Cale Clegg. So now, here we are with the Minnesota Wild, who, as I said earlier, were one of the two teams that made me the most sad during this last couple of days, because I was very much looking forward to the potential of Matt Dumba in a Kraken uniform. Now, with Dumba, I did know that there was a pretty good chance that Minnesota would find some way to do something to make sure that they didn't lose him for free in expansion. They already did that once when Vegas was picking, but I don't think anybody was expecting the way that they chose to do it, because while everybody else was making trades and GMs were calling other GMs, Minnesota was calling their own guys to let them know that they weren't going to be Wild anymore, because they of course decided to buy out the contracts of Zach Parise and Ryan Suter. Now the Parise buyout I wouldn't say was expected, but also wasn't a huge surprise either. It also probably had a little bit more to do with them having to figure out how to sign Kirill Kaprizov than it did expansion-related reasons, but it does also now mean that they can protect Ryan Hartman, which was another potential non-Dumba option. But the much more surprising buyout, and definitely the one that went over quite a bit worse with the player who was bought out, was Suter. Now this one, while it does also help make room for Kaprizov's contract, I think had a lot more to do with the Wild trying to find a way to not lose Dumba in expansion. Now, of course, this has led to a number of people being kind of, I don't know if upset's the right word, but kind of making fun of the Wild for having to get rid of a couple of players in order to protect Dumba now in back-to-back expansion drafts, but I think Dumba's probably worth it and definitely not the type of guy that you'd want to lose for free. Either way though, as far as where that leaves the Kraken and the expansion draft, it probably comes down now to either Carson Soucy on the defensive end, who is the guy that I'm going to end up taking here, or the exposed goaltender, which I thought was going to be Cam Talbot, and honestly I was ready to pick him, but then they kind of surprised at least me anyway in protecting Talbot and exposing Kaapo Kähkönen. So now I could definitely see them going with Kähkönen, but I still think that Soucy is probably the more likely option. Another one of the admittedly numerous teams that has been making headlines over the last few days would, of course, be the Montreal Canadiens. Now for them, it wasn't so much about trades they made as it was about who they ended up exposing. And that's because we knew, even before the exposure lists came out, that they had convinced Carey Price to waive his no movement clause in order to protect Jake Allen. Now, Carey Price potentially waiving his no movement clause and being available is something that we discussed as a possibility earlier on in the season, well before the playoffs. He does have a pretty, let's just say, not ideal looking contract that, based on his regular season play, seemed like it would very much keep him safe. But then the playoffs happened and the Canadiens ended up a few games away from hoisting the Stanley Cup, so it's a little bit more tempting now. That having been said though, it is a pretty big contract at $10.5 million for the next 5 years for a goaltender who is 33 and, at least during the regular season, didn't necessarily seem to still be in his prime. Either way, the point is, I just don't think that they'll take Carey Price, as tempting as that might be and as big of a name and headline as that would make for the Kraken right out of the gate. Also, there were a couple of other guys that were exposed here that could be tempting as well, those being Phillip Danault, who is set to be a UFA, and I don't really see them taking him either. They might take a swing at him in free agency if he doesn't get signed by the Canadiens right after the expansion draft, but I don't think he's the pick by the Kraken in the expansion draft. And then there's also Jonathan Drouin, who is going to be my pick here, but he did miss the end of the season and playoffs with personal issues going on, so it is going to be somewhat dependent on what his call with Ron Francis, which I'm assuming there will be one, how that call ends up going and how he's feeling right now. If he just isn't ready to come back to hockey, then the Kraken probably pass on him and go with another option here, but if he's going to be ready to start off next season, then I think the Kraken would be somewhat foolish not to take him. So again, because he's the best player available, I will take Drouin here, but again, if he's not ready to play hockey again by next season, he's definitely not cheap, and the Kraken probably would be better served to go with somebody from the defensive end, like either Haydn Fleury or maybe Brett Kulak. The Predators are the first team that we've looked at here that is going that 8 skaters and a goalie route. And I said 8 skaters and a goalie instead of the 4-4 like we've usually been calling it because the Predators took a little bit of a different approach and went with 3 forwards and 5 defensemen on their protection list. Of course, they also ended up moving Ryan Ellis to Philadelphia, so this now makes room for both Alex Courier and Felipe Myers, who they got back from Philadelphia on the defensive end. Now, originally with the moves that they were making, I thought that it was because they were trying to make room in order to protect Calle Jarnkrok on the forward end with a 4-4 protection list, but again, they ended up deciding to go 3-5, so Jarnkrok is still available, and that is who I did pick in my original mock draft, but I've actually switched to now thinking that it's more likely that Yakov Trenin will be the pick here. And this ultimately has more to do with the fact that Trenin is quite a bit cheaper, and like we just talked about, the Kraken have been pretty upfront about the fact that they want to stay closer to the minimum than the max, and I think this is a good place to save some money, and Trenin is a pretty good young prospect option that they could definitely help develop. As far as the New Jersey Devils are concerned, the only thing that changed on this protection list from my original one is the addition of Ryan Graves from Colorado. So yeah, there's no way Graves is coming to Seattle at this point. Of course, in order to protect Graves, that does mean that now Will Butcher is exposed, but while he is an option, I still think it's much more likely that the Kraken end up taking Nathan Bastian here, so I'm going to have him as my pick, and nothing changes as far as the Kraken are concerned. And again, just because I know someone will ask, the only way that they end up taking PK Subban is if they're convinced to by New Jersey, which maybe New Jersey does if they really don't want to lose Bastian, but I kind of don't expect it. The New York Islanders protection list does look a little bit different from what I was originally thinking it would look like, but it doesn't really, I think, end up changing in the long run who the Kraken end up taking, as Kieffer Bellows is still exposed, and I still think they take him over either Jordan Eberle or Josh Bailey, who were exposed, although I did originally have them protected. Of course, another very possible option here that Seattle could end up going with would be Otto Koivula, which is honestly kind of to me a coin flip between him and Bellows, but I still think I'd rather have Bellows, which is why I went with him. And of course, Nick Leddy is now gone, so he isn't an alternative option. And when I say gone, I mean he's still playing, he just doesn't play for the Islanders anymore. With the Rangers protection list, there's fewer differences here. In fact, there's only one difference between their list and the one that I originally had, that being the fact that they protected Kevin Rooney instead of Colin Blackwell. That having been said, again, I don't think it changes the outcome. I still think that the Kraken probably go with Julien Gauthier here, and I think it's a lot more solid of a pick than I would say with Kieffer Bellows, as with the Rangers, I don't see as many alternatives that are as good of an option as Gauthier. With the Ottawa Senators, this is another team where there's only one difference between their protection list and the one that I originally had in my mock draft, that being that they protected Austin Watson instead of Evgeny Dadonov. And again, I don't think that this really changes the pick for me. I'm still going here with Chris Tierney. And I didn't mean for that to rhyme, but what are you gonna do? And then there's the Philadelphia Flyers, who were another team that were busy making trades over the last couple of days. Like we already talked about, they traded Felipe Myers for Ryan Ellis. There's a little bit more to that deal, but as far as those two are concerned, they just swapped protection spots on the respective teams. But then they also traded away Nolan Patrick from the forward end, which seemed like that was their way of making room for JVR on the forward end, which is the guy that I originally took in my first mock draft. But then protection lists came out and JVR wasn't on theirs. Not only that, but they took away the cheaper forward option from the team by protecting Abe Kubel instead of Jacob Voracek. Now, Shane Gostisbehere is still available on the defensive end, but now with JVR still exposed and Voracek as a potential secondary option, especially again with Abe Kubel out of the way, I think it's pretty safe to say that the Kraken are probably going to be picking up a veteran, an expensive veteran, but a veteran player that can contribute right away, likely on a top line in Seattle. And to me, that's JVR. As a Kraken fan, probably one of the most disappointing names that I saw on a protection list that I wasn't necessarily expecting to see there was Teddy Bluger for the Pittsburgh Penguins. This is somebody that I did pick in my last mock expansion draft, and really ever since picking him I've only become more excited about the potential of him being a Kraken. But now that is no longer an option, as he is on this protection list, taking the spot of Brendan Tanev, so it was definitely not one that I saw coming, like I said. Of course, there still is a pretty decent option here in Zach Aston-Reese, who now is the guy that I think the Kraken end up going with. I don't know that it ends up making a huge difference to how the Kraken's future ends up playing out, but Blueger would have been a good pick. Again, Zach Aston-Reese will be a good replacement. Of course, there still is the option that they could go with a more expensive but more experienced forward like Jason Zucker, or now Brandon Tanev, but again, with them going closer to the cap minimum, or at least that's what they're saying, I think Zach Aston-Reese is probably the pick here. With the San Jose Sharks, there was really only one surprise on this protection list, and that was the addition of the name Jonathan Dahlian to it. Now, Dahlian wasn't necessarily a huge surprise to see protected. I did think he had at least an outside chance at getting the 7th spot, but the guy's name who he ended up taking the spot of was not the one that I would have expected to come off of the list. That being Ryan Donato. Oh, and of course, Adin Hill's the protected goaltender. As we talked about, he was traded from Arizona, so he won't be coming to Seattle. Obviously, you can still see that I do have the Kraken here taking Dylan Gambrell, instead of Ryan Donato, who is probably the better player between the two, or almost certainly the better player between the two. The reason for this is again just because the Kraken do have to take 20 players with contracts through the 2022 season, which Gambrell does have, and Donato does not, as he is set to be an RFA. Now, if there was one place where we were to make a swap in order to get another guy under contract somewhere else and open up a spot for a non-contracted player, this is probably where I would use it in order to take Donato rather than Gambrell. But for now, I thought that the best options were the ones we took, and Gambrell still is a decent alternative even if he isn't necessarily the best player available from the Sharks. Donato being available, though, does pretty much protect Alex True and Maxim Latunov, who are also both RFAs, and if the Kraken are going to take a non-contracted player here, it's going to be Donato. Moving over to the St. Louis Blues, though, if you aren't quite as concerned about saving cap space as the Kraken have said that they could be, then this is definitely a place where we could pick up another contracted player, because currently I have the Kraken taking Vince Dunn, which is the guy I originally had them taking. However, there is a surprise available name here in Vladimir Tarasenko on the forward end. Now believe me, I know if there's one pick in this entire draft that I expect people to disagree with the most, it's probably this one, because yes, Tarasenko is a pretty big name to be left available, and certainly could contribute and help out quite a bit on probably a top line for the Kraken, where they're certainly going to need the help as we've talked about. But again, this is a lot more about the contract that he has and the fact that the Kraken do want to be saving a good amount of cap space for free agency and going into the season. Plus, there is a cheaper contracted option on the forward end that could still be a pretty good player for Seattle, that being Sammy Blais. So if we do want to get a contracted guy and still have a cheaper contract, then Sammy Blais probably the guy. If you just want the biggest name, it's Tarasenko, but I'm still going to stick with the solid young defenseman in Vince Dunn. Now you might remember from a few minutes ago, if you have been watching through this whole thing to this point, that we talked about just how bad the exposure list is for the Dallas Stars. The polar opposite of that, though, is the team that beat them in the Stanley Cup Finals in 2020 in the Tampa Bay Lightning, whose exposure list, let's just say, I wish the Kraken could skip a few of the teams like the Stars and just pick a few players from here. Now this Lightning protection list is probably the one that's the most different from what I expected, as they did decide to go the 4-4-1 protection route, which means that guys like Andre Palat, Alex Killorn, and Yanni Gourde are all exposed on the forward end, all to make sure that they could protect Ryan McDonagh. Now, for the sake of this draft, because I'm not going to get too deep into predicting trades that the Kraken will make during the expansion draft, I'm going to have the Kraken picking Yanni Gourde here because, again, they need as much help up the middle as they can get, and Gourde can definitely provide that. But if there is one trade that the Kraken are almost guaranteed to make, or I shouldn't say guaranteed, but most likely to make, it's probably a trade with the Lightning, and it again probably involves Tyler Johnson. It's hard to say what else could be involved in this trade. Kerfoot's name has been thrown around, and the Lightning did just pick up a few more draft picks via trade in the last couple of days, so there probably will be some draft picks involved. But there still is a chance that a trade doesn't happen, and if that's the case, I think Yanni Gourde is the pick. Regardless of what a trade could look like with Tampa Bay though, if they're going to try to convince Seattle to not take Gourde or Palat especially, it's going to cost them quite a bit. Another team that also looks like they could be trying to make a trade with the Kraken would be the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, with Toronto, it's not necessarily that this protection list looks all that different from what I was expecting. In fact, it looks exactly like the one I was expecting, but it has more to do with the fact that in the last couple of days, they made a trade to pick up Jared McCann from Pittsburgh, and now they have him exposed. And unless they've just picked up McCann to try to bait the Kraken away from Kerfoot, I would have a hard time seeing them picking him up via trade just to let him go for free in the expansion draft. Plus, there is the option that they could be trying to incentivize Seattle away from either Kerfoot or McCann, and there is also the chance that the Kraken then take Dermott, but again, if the Leafs are going to try to get Seattle to take somebody other than one of those three, they're going to have to sweeten the pot a fair amount, as those are pretty good options for the Kraken to start out with. With the Vancouver Canucks, Seattle's future rival just across the border, well, let's just say this is another one of the teams that I wish the Kraken could skip in order to pick another player from the Lightning. Unfortunately, that's just not how this whole thing works, and the Kraken still have to take a Vancouver Canuck. Now, there still has been talk about the Canucks trying to make a trade with the Kraken, and there's also rumors that the Kraken have been looking pretty hard at Braden Holtby, but I personally still don't really see a reason for the Kraken to go with Holtby, and there is also Cole Lind that a lot of people have been excited about, but again, I think those non-contracted options could be better spent elsewhere, so again, I'm just sticking with Zack MacEwen here. It's a prospect pick that is kind of a, for you baseball fans, probably a 4A type of player, but, you know, they got to pick somebody, and maybe he turns into something down the road. Either way, he's a cheap, contracted center, so could be worse. With the Washington Capitals, this is another protection list that hasn't changed at all from the one that I had a month ago, which does mean that Alexander Ovechkin is exposed, and probably also means that the Capitals front office is getting just all sorts of calls from fans that don't really understand the inner workings of how this whole thing works. But again, there's no way that the Kraken actually take Ovechkin unless they just decide that there isn't another player here that they want and they want to make a big splashy headline. But I think that would be a waste because Vitek Vanacek is a pretty good option in goal and definitely the guy that I think they end up going with here. And finally, we round things out with the Winnipeg Jets. And for us Kraken fans who were watching over the last few days as some of the players we were excited about seeing in Seattle get traded away to teams that would then protect them, or let's say the Wild buying out Suter so they could protect Dumba, when the Jets said that they were trying to get rid of Mason Appleton, that also was something that was, let's just say, worrying to those of us that were excited about him coming to Seattle. Fortunately, the Jets were not successful in getting rid of him, so now Mason Appleton can in fact come to the Kraken, and honestly, outside of Driedger, who's basically confirmed, this is probably the pick that I feel most solid about, especially considering the most tempting option that the Kraken could have been tempted away from Appleton by, in Logan Stanley, is now protected, and that is the one difference on that protection list from what I originally had. Of course, Stanley did take the spot of Dylan DeMello, who I guess could be a tempting option, but if the Kraken don't take Mason Appleton, I will definitely be disappointed. But since Appleton is, at least for this next season, over $2 million cheaper than DeMello, I'd be pretty surprised if they didn't take him. All in all then, honestly, I think this is a pretty decent starting roster for the Kraken. Now, obviously a lot of things are going to change. There will be some trades, so not all of these picks will be just straight up picks like they are here. And they also will be trading some guys and picking up guys during free agency, so it's not like this is going to be the final roster. But at least as far as coming out of the expansion draft is concerned, compared to what Vegas's looked like at the time anyway, I do think this looks comparable, if not better. Now, obviously, if the Kraken want to be anywhere near as good as Vegas was out of the gate, they are going to have to make some pretty good pickups in those trades and during free agency, as well as having a few of these guys come out with career seasons right out of the gate in Seattle. So, not saying Seattle's going to be going to the Stanley Cup Finals in their first year by any means, but at least right out of the expansion draft at the time it's happening, I think it looks pretty good. Now, this team is a little bit older than my last mock draft, and I do think the Kraken probably go with a bit of a younger team, so who knows if that changes things a little bit. And it is also more expensive than my last mock draft, and again, the Kraken want to stay closer to that minimum. And this could have been even more expensive with guys like Tarasenko on it. So it'll be interesting to see where the Kraken decide to pick up those bigger contracts for the veterans and where they decide to maybe go with a cheaper option to afford themselves more cap space for future moves. But obviously, before we wrap things up, I'd love to hear what you guys think down in the comments section, especially when it comes to whether or not the Kraken maybe should go a little bit closer to the cap maximum so they can pick up guys like Carey Price and Vladimir Tarasenko, or if maybe you think they should go even cheaper and have even more space for free agency and potential trades during next season. Or maybe you just have a different opinion on some of the picks and would like to share those. Either way, if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there will be buttons for that kind of stuff down below. Otherwise, I will be doing a lines and kind of what this would look like if this was an actual roster, probably in the next couple of days. So until then, stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace.